Hi there. So, everyone pretty much knows the basic story of Chanukah. The Greeks made decrees against the Jews, the Maccabees fought, got the temple back, and the oil miraculously lasts for 8 days. But not everyone knows all the background history of the story and all the details, like what were the Greeks doing in Israel? Why were they making decrees against the Jews? And what did the Jewish community in Israel look like at that time? In this series, we're going to have a little bit of an in-depth look at the story of Chanukah, and hopefully we'll gain a better understanding into what exactly was going on. What you're looking at is a map of the Greek Empire, the conquest of Alexander the Great. In approximately the year 330 BCE, Alexander defeated the Persian Empire. And the land of Israel over here, which was previously under Persian rule, now came under the control of the Greeks. It wasn't much later, the year 313 BCE, that Alexander the Great died. And after his death, his kingdom was divided into like a bunch of little mini-kingdoms. The main ones were the Ptolemaic kingdom, which were also known as the Egyptian Greeks, and the Seleucid kingdom, which were known as the Syrian Greeks. And as you can see, the country of Israel is kind of nestled in the middle, and it switched hands back and forth between these two empires. Now, at that time in Israel, there was a relatively small Jewish community. A lot of Jews had remained behind in Babylon after the destruction of the first temple, and there was quite a large Jewish community in Alexandria, in Egypt as well. From a governmental perspective, the Jews were pretty much fully autonomous, and the Greeks didn't mix in their daily life. The Jewish leader, the main person in the Jewish community, was at the time the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and his responsibilities, they were primarily religious responsibilities, like temple service, and he was a spiritual figurehead. He also had political responsibilities. And he was like the liaison between the Greek kingdom and the Jewish community. What I want to focus on in this class is the impact that the new Greek neighbors had on Jewish life and the Jewish community living in Israel at that time. The Greeks then were the most culturally advanced of all civilizations. They were advanced in literature, philosophy, architecture, and technology, and slowly Greek ideas and values began creeping their way into Jewish life. You see, the Jewish community is surrounded by Greek cities, and you would have had travelers traveling through the land of Israel. Israel would have been used as a trade route from Egypt maybe to nearby Phoenicia, or to further out eastern countries. As well, you would have had a lot of Jewish people coming from different Jewish communities, like let's say the Jewish community in Babylon, coming to visit Israel, or the Jewish community in Alexandria coming to visit, maybe for the holidays. And they would have brought with them all kinds of Greek books and Greek ideas, and that kind of influence started creeping its way in. Just to point out a few areas where we do see that there was an impact from Greek life. We know that at that time, many people changed their names and adopted Greek names. So, names like Shimon would have become Simon. And names like Joshua, the Jewish name, would have now been called Jason instead, which is the Greek-sounding version. Another thing we know is, in regards to language, that whereas until then people would have conversed and written and wrote and spoken mostly in ancient Aramaic or ancient Hebrew, people started reading and writing in Greek. And that kind of opened them up to all kinds of opportunities to read Greek books and Greek ideas. What's really interesting is, we know at that time, one of the Ptolemaic kings, he commissioned 72 rabbis to come move down to Egypt and to translate the entire Torah into Greek, which later became known as the Septuagint. And what I think is just so interesting about that story is it just goes to show how proficient people were in the Greek language in the Jewish community that they were able to make a professional translation of the Torah. Now, this new Greek influence, it created a large divide amongst the Jewish people. There were those who felt that it's a great opportunity. They appreciated the new culture they'd become a part of, and they adopted the enlightenment that they'd learned from their more sophisticated neighbors. They became known as the Hellenists, or Misyavnim in Hebrew. The rabbis, they opposed these changes, and they saw that the Greek influence and ideas as presenting a challenge to the way of the Torah and to Jewish life. Now, as this divide was growing, a new king was elected to the Seleucid Empire. In the year 175 BCE, King Antiochus Epiphanes became the new king. Now, he was an extremely ambitious man, and he looked for new ways to promote Hellenism and Greek ideas throughout his entire kingdom. He was also known to be a really greedy and unstable person, and he became famous for his crazy antics and his immoral behavior. Interestingly, his real name was Epiphanes, which actually means divine, or divinely manifest, but he became known by a nickname of Epimanes, which in Greek means a madman, because of his abnormal behavior. Now, the Hellenistic community amongst the Jews, they jumped on this opportunity, and they developed close ties and relationships with this King Antiochus because they felt that he would benefit their cause and help promote their program. What we're going to see is, I think, the biggest change and development in the Jewish community is when the highest Jewish position, which we mentioned before was the Kohen Gadol, it becomes appointed, an appointment of the Greek king, rather than being the representative of the Jewish community. And we're going to have a closer look at that story and the continuation of the story, hopefully in the next class.